season of the LGBTQ2IA plus parenting then and now. And as per usual for getting started, I want to just go through a little bit of our business of our slides. So the first thing, of course, is that we do have live Spanish translation from Maria Jose Gutierrez, all the way from Colombia. And the conversation will therefore be in Spanish and English. In your webinar controls, click interpretation, click the language that you would like to hear, and to only hear the interpreted language, click mute original audio. We also have closed captioning and live transcript. So in your webinar controls, click closed caption, click on show subtitle, and to adjust the size of your subtitles, click subtitle settings. And I think the next slide is that we'd like to thank our sponsor. Oh no, sorry, that's my mistake. Let's start with the Q&A in the chat. So if you have a question for presenters, please use the Q&A feature to ensure that we see your question. And I would just want to be clear with people. Usually we start Q&A towards the last half hour. Today, we're starting it immediately upon beginning because we have one of our presenters, Senator Sear, who will only be with us for the first 45 minutes. So if people have questions that they'd like, particularly for him to address, we would like to make sure we get them in early. So feel free to use the Q&A right from the get-go if you have questions for any of our presenters. If, on the other hand, you have a comment or a technical issue that you want to share, use the chat feature for that to speak with all the other attendees and BTC support staff, and choose all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your comments. And yes, we would like to thank our sponsors for this whole series, which is Bezos Family Foundation, Room.org, Brazelton Touchpoints Foundation, and BTC's community of supporters. So as you can probably see from my demeanor, I am so excited to have these particular guests on today, especially to close out our series for this season. The main thing I want to say is that it is my sort of pet passion to look at the connections between our most intimate personal experiences, especially in family life, and large cultural institutions such as media, education, and of course, policy and the law. And today's panel gives us an ideal way to think about the reciprocal relationship between intimate personal experience and policy and the law in particular. It also gives us a chance to really dig into the other part of the title of our series, the then and now, because among the people we have here is Thera Webb, who was born in 1980 and raised by lesbian parents Denise Webb and Denise Duclos, who we will call Chloe for the rest of this show for simplicity. And they therefore were doing that during the 80s. And then we have Senator Sear and Patience Crozier, Patience who goes by Polly, who are very currently working on policy issues pertaining to LGBTQ families. So I want to start by reading you their bios. I'm going to try to be quick so we can get right to the conversation, but they do all have pretty impressively long and detailed bios. So here we go. We have Senator Julian Sear, as I said, for the first 45 minutes today. And he serves in the Massachusetts Senate representing Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket. He was first elected in the Senate in November of 2016. So he's now serving his fourth term and is among the youngest senators in the 40-member body. He serves at the Senate Assistant Majority Whip, the chair of the Joint Committee on Public Health, and he's the vice chair of the Joint Committee on Mental Health, Substance Use, and Recovery, and is also on committees with oversight of healthcare financing, housing, elder affairs, telecommunications, utilities, and energy, and racial equity and inclusion. And Senator Sear graduated with a degree in public policy and community health from New York University and from the David Bonnet Leaders Fellowship at Harvard Kennedy School's Senior Executives in State and Local Government Program. But he will tell you, as I was really pleased to learn, that he learned many of the skills he uses daily from waiting tables and cooking behind the line for 14 seasons at his family's restaurant in Truro. So welcome, Senator Sear. We also have Patience Crozier, again, who for short we will go with Polly, who joined GLAD, LGBTQ, if I'm going to get this right, Advocates and Defense, in October of 2016. And Polly came from private legal practice where her work had already focused on LGBTQ probate and family law, which included adoption, divorce, dissolution, guardianship, paternity, parentage, name changes, gender marker changes, and assisted reproduction issues. Polly's engaged in cutting-edge trial court and appellate litigation involving assisted reproduction and parentage. Hunter v. Rose in 2012, adoption of a minor 2015, Cardenin v. Gallagher 2016, and adoption of Daphne 2020, and JM v. CG 2023. So welcome, Polly. And then we have the Webb and Duclos family. Denise Webb has been actively involved in Minding the Baby, which she can tell us more about later, since its inception, and takes an active role in the MTB training team in Denmark. And she's worked with them to develop introductory training on clinical approaches for reflective parenting programs that's drawn participants from around the world. She also serves as a consultant for a similar home visitation program in Florida, was an integral part of the Yale consult team for the MTB program as it replicated efforts in the UK and Florida. So Denise Webb and Denise Duclos are the mothers of Thera Webb. I'm gonna skip to Thera for a minute and then come back to Denise Duclos. So Thera, raised by lesbian moms, again, born 1980, works as the Women at MIT project archivist and focuses on the history of women in STEM. And she also serves as Collage International Retro Advisory Board, working on preserving the history of queer spawn. She's also active in social justice and freedom movements and community organizing, has an MLS in Archives and Cultural Heritage from Simmons University, and an MFA in Poetry from UNC Greensboro. So she's the author of 2 chapbooks I'm eager to read, On the Shoulders of the Bear and Reality Asylum, and her first full-length collection, The Witch, a Play, is forthcoming from White Stag Publishing in 2025. And last and definitely not least is Denise Duclos, also in early childhood education, currently retired, but she spent 50 years in various roles as a teacher and director of early childhood nonprofit childcare centers. For 25 years before retiring, she was the project director for the City of New Haven's state-funded school readiness program, which is a state-funded initiative contracting with local early childhood programs to better serve families with preschool children of low and moderate income. And there were approximately 1,000 children enrolled annually. And again, Denise Webb has co-parented Thera Denise Duclos. Chloe has co-parented with Denise Webb. So welcome to everybody. I'm hoping people will turn their video on and join us and we can start our conversation. So we have, let's see, I see Polly Crozier, I see Senator Sear, Denise Duclos, and Denise Webb, and Thera. And that's our panel, so welcome. I guess I wanted to start with you, Senator Sear, and maybe Polly Crozier in this too, to give us a little bit of context of the kinds of issues that you see yourselves as really currently. I know there's the Parentage Act happening in Massachusetts, but maybe you can tell us a little bit, Senator Sear, about the work that you're doing that pertains to LGBTQ families.
Sure. Sure. So good to be with all of you. Greetings from Provincetown, Massachusetts, the queerest place in the world. You know, look, I'm serving in my 4th term in the Massachusetts legislature. I'm one of 3 openly LGBTQ plus members in the Senate. There's 10 of us total in the legislature out of 200. So, you know, getting to 5%. Of course, we want more. You know, but long, you know, came up at an age when, you know, I certainly, you know, growing up in the town just south of Provincetown, Truro, in a pretty accepting family, you know, really, I think had LGBTQ family members in my life and people for quite some time. This has been really sort of core to my sort of public service. Certainly the experience growing up, with the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and the 90s, right, where my parents lost about half their, closest friends. I think certainly is part of the recipe in which, I kind of came into public health work and LGBTQ advocacy. And here in Massachusetts, right, we've really stood at the forefront or had stood at the forefront of inclusive progressive policies, particularly when it comes to support of LGBTQ plus people. Not just the first state in the country to legalize marriage, first state in the country to have non-discrimination protections for gays and lesbians, a whole suite of policies, programs. Actually, my friend Polly, who works at GLAD was a big part of that recipe. But we've really fallen behind in terms of inclusive parentage laws. We're the only state in New England that has not updated our parentage statutes. Our parentage statutes are archaic. They don't sort of represent Massachusetts values. Constituents I talk to are shocked to hear that, Massachusetts families, when they're traveling out of state, my colleague, Jack Patrick Lewis, who's a representative in Metro West, has several children. When he and his husband travel, they travel with birth certificates of their kids. Or when my sister and sister-in-law, had my nephew Kian, my sister is the birth mom. My sister-in-law, went through an adoption process, that cost, over $2,000, right, just to ensure that they have that they have protections, right, because of our outdated parentage statutes and laws. And this is ironic because Massachusetts has, I think, actually the highest rate or percentage of families that are created in a non-traditional way. So this is where we're sort of a real outlier. I would sort of say this is where I think we've rested on our laurels a little bit, right? We tend to think, oh, we were there for marriage, we were there for non-discrimination. We've got a lesbian governor, we got all sorts of queer folks, at the highest echelons, in our state. But we've really got some real work to do. And this is why the Mass Parentage Act is so important. I think we've also got more work to do just in parentage, right? How, families, how LGBTQ families are built and people are building our families. There's a whole host of that work as well. But parentage really is one where we're an outlier, and we've got to pass this law and make sure that we're bringing our parentage statutes into the 21st century.
So you've been working on that, and it's at what stage of development is that?
So the Mass Parentage Act, so this is bipartisan legislation. In the Senate, I filed this with Bruce Tarr, who's our minority leader. In the House, my colleague, Representative Sarah Peake, who's a Democrat in leadership, filed this with Hannah Kane, who's a Republican. The House passed the parentage law just a few weeks ago. In Pride Month, it's over in the Senate. I think this is something we expect will take up. We didn't get to it in Pride Month. We had a big climate bill and a big housing bill we had to get done. So I think we're feeling well sort of positioned here. But it's really taken quite a bit. It's taken a whole coalition, ton of work. And I think it's really reflective that, even in a state like Massachusetts that fashions itself as being such a welcoming, affirming place for LGBTQ people, that we can't rest on our laurels, that we've got quite a bit of work to do. And even once parentage is done, and I'm increasingly optimistic, it'll get on Maura Healey's desk and she will sign it into law. But there's a lot more that we need to do, particularly in an era where LGBTQ people are under attack like never before. Particularly in nearly over 24 states, taking action, my counterparts in other legislatures, demonizing and going after LGBTQ people, particularly LGBTQ young people and LGBTQ families, purely for political gain and exploitation. And really, this means that a place like Massachusetts, we can't take any of that for granted, and we're trying not to.
Got it. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if we could slow down a little bit for those of us who are not in the legal or political arena, just because it is complicated, the relationship between the development of state policies and federal, how things interact, across states and with the federal guidelines. So I'm just thinking to tell you exactly how much I hope you can fill us in on. If you go back in 1996 with the DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, right? And that literally said that no matter what any given state had decided about gay and lesbian marriage. At that point, my understanding is there was no marriage in any states, but it was going to preclude any other state from recognizing it. It was going to codify in federal law that there was only heterosexual marriage. Guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that didn't get overturned until 2015, essentially. So even though we in Massachusetts, as well as other states, we were the first state that had gay marriage in exactly 20 years ago, right? 2004. It didn't have the meaning nationally. So similarly, we have gay marriage, we have the overturning of DOMA in 2015, and yet you're saying that there's such a need for parentage laws that you have friends who are traveling to another state with birth certificates. I think for people outside the law, myself included, it's a little hard to understand all of that. And I wonder if Polly, as well as you, Senator Sear, you can just help us understand the context of these kinds of policy issues and how they impact families. Anybody want to take a stab at that big picture?
Well, I'll hop in to say, in terms of the big picture, you're right that it's complicated. And we have a system, a federal system, and then we have, of course, like every state has serves kind of as their own incubator and has their own state constitution and state laws as well. When we talk about the federal right to marry, that's really a federal right to marry under the U.S. Constitution. And actually, DOMA fell for the first part of DOMA fell in 2013 with the Windsor case, and then the final nails in the coffin were in 2015 with the Obergefell case. And the outdated archaic laws that Senator Sear is talking about in terms of parentage, he's really talking about state family law. So family law is really, in general, a creature of the state. Each state has laws about who can get married, how do you get divorced, how do you, and when we talk about parentage, we're talking about how do you secure a child to their parent, which is for children such an important foundational legal relationship, because that parent-child relationship is the source of so many rights for children, right? The right to the ability to get health insurance, the ability to get Social Security benefits, the ability for someone to make decisions about you, the very ability to be in kind of the love and care of the adult who's parenting you. So parentage law is a creature of state law. And so that's why we find ourselves, despite the fact that we have national marriage equality, is that the states remain a patchwork in terms of protections for children. And that patchwork makes families vulnerable, particularly LGBTQ families who, in general, oftentimes one of the parents does not have a genetic connection with the child. So let's take Massachusetts, for example. And right, Senator Sear is 100% right. Our state parentage statutes haven't been updated in over 40 years. And we have the highest number of births through assisted reproduction in the whole country. But we don't have the statutory framework to protect children born through assisted reproduction. So that means, for example, that if you're an unmarried couple who are having children through assisted reproduction, your kids don't have that automatic protection like other children. We have at this point a system where we have protections for children who are born into marriages and children who are genetically connected to their parents. But for all those other diverse ways that children come into our family, whether it's through surrogacy, through assisted reproduction, through what we call functional parentage, right? Like de facto parents, people who have stepped up to really play a permanent role in the life of a child when there wasn't any pre-planning. Those kids at this point in Massachusetts, and frankly in many other states, don't have the protections they need and the equality they need to be secure and stable. So that's just a little bit of an overview of like when we talk about there's no national parentage law. It's each state. And I have to say, yeah.
Just to understand, so marriage does not do away with the need for this, is what you're saying. And is that only because not everybody gets married, or once you are married, is all of this fine and well? That's my question for you.
So marriage does not solve the issue, right? And that's for a few reasons. First of all, yes, many people don't get married. I think, I can't remember the Massachusetts statistics, but nationwide, I mean, I think it's something like 40% of children are born to unmarried couples. And then also for people who are married, a child born into a marriage is the child of the married folks. but that's a presumption, right? And it can be rebutted. And oftentimes it can be rebutted, like particularly I used to be a divorce lawyer, right? You know, people are not at their best when their relationships are ending. You know, some people can try to rebut that presumption because there's not a genetic connection, right? And also when people are traveling between states, it can be rebutted based on what other state laws might be. So what we really want for all children is to have a judicial decree or the equivalent of a judicial decree, because in every state, a judicial decree or equivalent will have full faith and credit and will be recognized no matter where you go. And that's like the gold standard of security for children, right? We want to make sure that we're going one step beyond marriage. Marriage is fundamentally so important, and I'm so grateful. And I think it's in a kind of an automatic protection, which is really helpful. But particularly for LGBTQ families, they need to do a little bit more.
Got it. Okay. Okay. And do you want to spell out like what the Parentage Act is saying apropos these families? Senator Sear, maybe you want to let us know some of the details.
Sure. So what the Parentage Act does is it just really provides really clear guidance under the law for parents, for donors, for surrogates, and for the courts in determining parentage, right? So it does, the bill as drafted secures LGBTQ families' rights to establish parentage. It ensures that children who are born via assisted reproductive technology have a clear route to establish parentage. It also provides coherent standards around how parentage is established through surrogacy. And there's also a clear standard for courts to resolve competing parental complaints or parentage claims here. So it codifies, Polly was talking about how much of the law in Massachusetts is through case law in the courts. So it codifies the precedents from our Supreme Judicial Court. And then hopefully will allow some efficiency and consistency. In absence of parentage, right, what this is looking like are LGBTQ families and other families, right, having to establish parentage through through having to go to court, having to do what my sister and sister-in-law had to do in private return, and hiring an attorney. I'm someone who is a sperm donor, made a donation to friends of mine who have a beautiful little child, right? We had to go through, or they really had to go through and pay, quite a bit of legal paperwork, right, to kind of do that, let alone the whole sort of cost associated with that, which is no sort of easy expense. And I think particularly in a world where, more and more of our families are just like not being confined to this heteronormative standard or expectation of, two cisgender straight people who are, conceiving a child, right? This is just like not how, families are built. And if you look at sort of the trends, in this current, if you look at Gen Z, right, over 20% of this population is identifying as LGBTQ plus in some way. So you're just going to see more and more of a need of this. And so what happens if we don't update our parentage laws? Look, people, like my sister and sister-in-law, or like my friends who I was a sperm donor to, right? These are people with some means and resources. And look, it's a headache. It's kind of unfair, but they figured it out, right? It's deeply unfair and inequitable to LGBTQ families and other non-traditional families, right, who don't have access to, don't have access to, frankly, the finances needed to, secure your rights to your children, and we're really putting Massachusetts families in a really vulnerable position. I think many families, LGBTQ families and other non-traditional families, might not even realize how vulnerable they are, and so this is where, God forbid, you end up in one of these states which has, doesn't have inclusive parentage laws, and something terrible happens, and unfortunately Gladys had to litigate some of these cases, where something terrible happens, and the state tries to take the kids away from the surviving parent, and I think many people in Massachusetts who are LGBTQ parents, who are non-traditional families, don't even realize how vulnerable they are. And so even more reason for us to update the law here, update our parentage laws. This is really a matter of equity and ensuring that, all people who are having families have access to secure their rights to their children and their family, not just those people, with the financial means to do so.
And we have right here with us, I know it might be a little patchwork to do this, but I'm going to try to speak to the issues at hand, and then we'll learn about your family, Denise, Chloe, and Thera, in more detail a little bit later. But I know you have things to say that are directly relevant to what Senator Sear and Polly are bringing up about what marriage did and didn't do. Also about you were raising Thera well before you could have gotten married, and even when the threat of being out presented danger to you with work, with custody questions, right? But Thera, I wonder if you want to speak to that, what it meant to you to be raised by Denise and Chloe in the absence of these kinds of policies that Senator Sear and Polly or Crozier are speaking of. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think my parents did a really excellent job protecting me from a lot of these worries. I didn't feel particularly like concerned about it, but I do remember, you know, like as a child, you're maybe like, what's going to happen to me if my parents die? Because I'm reading a lot of books about like being an orphan. And I knew that my grandparents would take me. That was like my understanding of the case. And very luckily, my grandparents and Chloe were good friends. And so I didn't have any concerns about being taken away from my parents. But at the same time, my parents used to get like a lesbian newsletter. And I remember reading things and seeing things in the news about families where the kid was taken away if like one parent died or another. And so I think even though I felt very secure in like whoever would raise me, like it was something that I understood was like the case for these other mysterious children of lesbians who apparently like existed in the world.
Mm-hmm. Did Denise, Chloe, either of you want to add anything to your own thoughts about that, the way the world was when you were raising Thera?
Yeah, well, it was complicated, and I do think we were trying very hard to protect Thera from any of the worries that we had. But we did have a court issue during custody that Thera's biological parent called me an unfit mother. And that's actually a story that I don't think Thera knew until last week when we talked about coming onto this program. So, you know, I remember going to my lawyer and being very concerned and saying, what do I do if it comes to the point where I go up before the judge and have to say that I'm going to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? And she looked at me and she said, you're going to lie, because there really isn't any other way around it. And that was shocking to me, honestly. And of course I would have done that. And I'm really glad that it ended up that it didn't come to that. But in the meantime, I had Child Protective Services come to the house. And it's really only due to our privilege of, you know, we rented a really nice house in a place that was a good neighborhood. And this woman came into the house and saw who I was and said, oh, looks like everything's fine here. I mean, it felt this close to thinking, and in fact, we did think that we needed another plan. That what if it all fell through? Could we take Thera and hide somewhere in another state? You know, I mean, people were doing that. They were running away with their child and trying to disappear. And I couldn't imagine doing that to my parents, but I also couldn't imagine losing my daughter.
And I think you're speaking to, I know when I wrote my book back in 1994, was looking at exactly some of the issues that you're talking about. There was, and Polly and Senator Sear can speak more to this more knowingly, I think, but there were per se, there were states that made the judgment that being lesbian or gay in and of itself per se was unfit. So I don't know if you were living in one of those states, but these were the dialogues that were happening. And I think, you know, part of what I'm hearing you all talk about, which is really so interesting to me, is just how these kinds of things, even if you don't lose your child because of it, or your child doesn't end up like not having connection to their non-biological parent because of grandparents who don't want that. A case that happened in that is listed in my book. I met some people where that had happened and wrote a lot about that. in Florida. But even if that hasn't happened, I think what you're speaking to psychologically, it's there with you. It's right in the fabric of your family for all of you. Sometimes spoken about, sometimes maybe not, is the other thing I'm hearing, like you protecting Thera having thoughts that she's not necessarily saying to you of worries like that. So that, I guess that's the then and now part, is we're all living now. This is not so long ago that you were in that situation. And also I again, Polly and Senator Siri could speak to that. There's plenty of places where people are still in very dire circumstances, or it could happen again. It's not like, oh, that doesn't go on anymore. So
Yeah, well, these are real questions, I think, that, as was spoken to, right, are being asked, right, by these children. Even my 5.5-year-old nephew, right, has some of these questions. And look, now there's like these great books that you can, that kind of tell a bit of the story about what they came from and all this sort of stuff. But that's a real anxiety. And I think, unfortunately, I hate to say it, but we're also facing the reality that we could even see a further backsliding of rights. I mean, if you look at where, over 24 states are going with some of the stuff, if you look at what an extremist Supreme Court has done, and I fear may do in this, unmitigated attack against LGBTQ plus people, we just can't afford to rest on our laurels in a state like Massachusetts. And I think it's just all the more urgent that, we take action here. Unfortunately, we sort of have to. I think something not something not we don't want to have to, but I think we have to really conceive of that as being a real reality, because we're seeing that. And unfortunately, we may very much see more of that as there's this extremism that is coming for our vulnerable community here.
I plus one to what the senator just said. And I have to say, unfortunately, to me, it's really not a now and then. It's this is the reality we live in every day. And we're working very hard. So many people, families, advocates, legislators to take a different path. I mean, unfortunately, I was a family, before I came to GLAAD, where obviously I do a lot of family law. I had my own practice, and it was not unusual for my clients to have their children taken away. I had a client who hit a rough spot with her partner. Her partner went on a vacation with their 18-month-old to Oregon State, canceled her cell phone and never came back. And we spent 4 years getting her back to the Commonwealth. And that was because of a lack of clarity of the law. And, the SJC eventually took that case and kind of clarified that particular situation. But we have in the Commonwealth really a history of really tragic stories that individual families, and particularly children, have suffered because of a lack of clarity in the law. And that's why the Parentage Act is so important, to bring into the black letter law what the rule is. And honestly, to put children first, because I think, our philosophy is that, children don't know much about the law. What they know is who's taking care of them. And we need to make sure that they are protected to the person who's taking care of them. I represented another woman whose ex unfortunately had a really significant medical event, and she had to run to court for a guardianship. And the Department of Children and Families called to say, where's the child? We're going to take the child into custody. And luckily we got a court order of guardianship before that happened. But this is every day in the this is not unusual. And I think, no child, no family should have to live in that kind of fear when there's another way to move forward. And I just submitted an amicus brief a few weeks ago in a Pennsylvania Supreme Court case where a child born into a marriage wasn't protected to the non-biological parent of that marriage because of a divorce. There was a case in Idaho. There's a case in Oklahoma. This is unfortunately a very real issue that families are facing. And, I really hope states start stepping up.
thank you for that, Polly, and for taking me out of my little Pollyannish bubble about how that was then. I appreciate that. And then there's all these sort of more, I don't even want to say necessarily less significant, smaller moments of day-to-day parenting. We're not having these understandings at an integrated cultural and personal level. Takes a toll. And I wonder, Chloe, if you could tell the story of going to Thera's school when there was an incident at school that you had concerns about, and what the teacher said to you, because you went without Denise. Remember? Concerning a
Yeah.
child bringing, I think, a weapon to school.
Right. Someone
Yeah.
in Tara's class brought a gun to school when she was in 6th grade. And I was just appalled. And because one, they didn't tell us right away. We heard it from Tara, which I thought was horrible. And there was no information about sort of how they were handling it with the kids. So I went to school and the principal said, well, who are you? And I said, well, I'm Tara, co-parent Tara with Denise Webb. And they said, well, you're not her parent, so we're not going to talk to you. I was just livid. So, I mean, there were those situations where who are you?
Yeah.
Came up. I mean, we weren't married, we didn't have a civil union at the time, and we just said that I co-parent Tara.
There wasn't even a term, right? You couldn't really say you were Tara's other mother, right?
Yeah.
There just wasn't a way to say that.
Yeah. And again, I guess that's like for me, something I'm so interested in is that just weaves its way through all of these day-to-day incidents, large and small. It's not just the ones that end in court with very dramatic and awful, custody questions, but even just day-to-day life is filled with the texture of not having shared understandings of who your family is. So I'm aware that Senator Sear, by the way, everyone else needs to be aware of this, will be with us maybe 10 more minutes or a little less. I have one more question for you, but before I ask it, I want to just see if we can get this chat question in. Okay. So I'm going to ask the chat question after I ask this question, just to make sure that I get Senator Sear on this. I know there's some other legislation that you're also dealing with. I believe, for example, is there anything about the banning of books that we're hearing so much about nationally? Is there anything on your plate around that?
Yeah, we do. We do have a bill, an act relative to free expression, and this is to provide protections both in our public libraries and also in our school libraries. Massachusetts, surprisingly, Massachusetts is 4th in the nation for attempted book ban attempts in public libraries and school libraries. I think folks again would be surprised Massachusetts. So there's a real need for this. We've seen a number of our public libraries, school libraries have these book ban attempts. In some instances, some pretty inappropriate responses, either within schools or within libraries. And so there's a real need to provide a framework for protections to follow the suit of states like Illinois and New Jersey that have had to put these protections in place. So this is legislation that I filed working in partnership with State Representative John Moran, who's also a member of our LGBT caucus, and a few other colleagues. It was just advanced favorably out of committee. It's coming over to the Senate, so hopefully it's something we can take up with. We got about 5 weeks to go to the end of the session on July 31st. But that's really crucial. Other legislation as well. I have an act relative to LGBTQ family building. Just so much of, right? Like I'm of the age, right, where my friends are. Many of my friends are going through the process of building families. I participated as a sperm donor. All of these policies and protocols and the coverage, the insurance coverage, the provider network is pretty heteronormative, heterocentric, and kind of left in the 20th century. And so that's legislation that I think we're trying to move as well, to update the ability to recognize that people are building families in non-traditional ways more and more, and that we're going to need those tools as well. The Senate has already passed legislation in Massachusetts to repeal. We still have archaic laws on the books in Massachusetts. They're invalidated by court decisions, but all sorts of horrible bad stuff dating from our Puritan past. So a lot that we're trying to get done this session, and I think really making sure that we don't rest on our laurels. One of the things I'm most proud of having worked on, and I teamed up with GLAAD and the ACLU and others to do this, is when we shortly after the Dobbs decision in Massachusetts, we passed one of the most expansive shield laws in the country to protect providers of abortion and reproductive health care. We also included gender affirming care. And so now under Massachusetts law, gender affirming care access is preserved. It's considered actually a constitutional right, access to it here in Massachusetts. And so that's really something where, I think we realize that now more than ever, we need to continue to be a beacon of welcoming and of protections for LGBTQ people, especially trans and non-binary people, just given the sad state of the environment that we're in. So a busy, full legislative agenda. Working on a lot of other things too, housing and PFAS and other sort of issues. I'm not a one-trick queer pony, but
absolutely.
parentage is the priority to get done.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about that though, because that's exactly right. You have constituents of all very diverse beliefs, right? What do you do with that? I was, for example, just reading an article about the foster care battle that happened 85 to 90 here in Massachusetts. And in that article back in 2015, the person who really was behind the whole bigotry of it said, wow, I was really a bigot and I'm sorry. I regret that I did that. And I've really learned a lot. So, I mean, people think and change and also have strong views. And I'm just to sort of see you out with this question. What do you do with all of your constituents with different views? How do you approach these hard issues?
Sure. I mean, I think certainly, I represent Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, and we're in the business of welcoming people, right? Especially these busy, warm summer months, right? We're in the business of hospitality. And so, broadly, there's a real sort of welcoming spirit that's across sort of my district. I really try to focus on, I mean, look, like the LGBTQ work is pretty deeply important to me. It's pretty important to a number of my constituents, right? But Provincetown's a town of about 3,500 and a district of 180,000 people. But we have queer people who live across Cape Cod and the islands. But I really try to focus on the issues that are facing Cape Codders and Islanders, right? And no matter where you are on the political spectrum, you're struggling with housing, right? We've got the worst, most acute housing crisis in Massachusetts here on Cape Cod and the islands because of, we're quite literally a peninsula, right? A really scarce resource. It's a luxury housing market, right? The pandemic put that problem on steroids. I'm someone who's spent my career working in public health, and so I chair the public health committee, working on a maternal health bill right now, trying to advance substance use protections. Also, these forever chemicals, these per and polyfluoroalkyl substances known as PFAS. We've got legislation there to advance it. And then just, a myriad of the bread and butter issues that come across your desk, right? As any legislator. And so, part of that is responsiveness. A part of that is, being a legislative maximalist and sort of taking on a lot and trying to be strategic about how you get it done. And look, my opponents will, there's some nasty extremist newspaper that's out there that often goes after legislators, and they've labeled me Dem homosexual Senator Sear, which I take as a compliment. But they'll go and take sort of like, what I think are like, perfectly fine, cute pictures of me at tea dance or whatever else here in Provincetown and try to exploit them for embarrassment. But hey, you know what? I'm in a little tank top. My arms look good, so we're fine. But really, I think our opponents trying to, make it seem like I'm sort of some one-trick pony. And what I feel really strongly, right, is that like, look, we have to be unapologetic and fierce in our demands that LGBTQ people are afforded equal protection under the law, and we also have to work on big challenges that face everyone, from housing. My district, the Cape and Islands, have a multi-billion-dollar wastewater problem. I spend a lot of time doing sewering, and so I just try to work on a whole host of things, including issues that are deeply personal to me and deeply personal to many of the people I represent.
That makes so much sense, and in doing so, you complicate everybody's wish for simple stereotypes. And to put you in a box, right? That's what I hear you saying. And I also hear, and I guess we'll talk more about this even when you're not here any longer with Polly, is that a lot of even the parentage things, these apply to children in lots of situations, not just LGBT.
Well, and this is why, right? Our bill is a bipartisan bill, right? This is me and the minority leader teaming up to get this done in the Senate. This is a longtime out lesbian in the House teaming up with a Republican member in the House to get the bill passed there. So, we really view, I think one of the things that makes me really proud to serve in Massachusetts is, at least in the legislature, LGBTQ issues are not considered sort of a partisan matter. This is something that, when you talk to my colleagues who have served for a long time, the thing they are most proud about was to be involved in marriage, that we really care about. And I think that, we really identify with the role that we've had in this civil rights movement, this movement for equal justice, the queer liberation movement. And, I think sometimes we need to be reminded of it, so we're not just resting on our laurels, but there's a real bipartisan deep well of goodwill and pride, true pride here in Massachusetts. And Polly and I are working hard to remind folks of that and get this legislation over the finish line.
And I'm aware, I think we're supposed to let you go now, right? Senator Crozier, thank you so much. It is, I first of all, thank you for all what you're doing, because I think that's so important, just to be out there and out and proud and caring at a human level about a lot of aspects of being human, which we all are, right? And I just so appreciate that. And then thank you so much for taking the time to come on and help us understand that a little bit better. It's really, really enlightening. So,
thank you for having me. It's an honor. Take care.
Bye. So, okay. One of the things I'm thinking about is that not just our audience, but also you, Polly, don't know very much about the Webb Duclos family. And I want to let them get a word in here and have some dialogue with you, because you know so much about the context in which they created and have lived their family life. So if we can start with that and maybe just get a little thumbnail sketch of the two of you and coming to be Thera's parents. Do you mean I can ask you something more specific?
Well, I mean,
know.
I can say that we both were early childhood educators in our 20s, and we met through work. We grew to really like each other's company, and the complicating thing was we were working with early childhood education, and in this particular homophobic culture in the 1980s, right? And so we were actually teachers in the same preschool that our daughter was in, which I guess two problems arose. One was that the families in the preschool felt like there was something up between the two of us, even though we remained very professional. But it was just, I think, the culture of the moment, right? And so it became that we had to be deeply closeted, and there was a certain amount. I will be friendly, but I will still say you were a little paranoid. We were always sure that someone was watching us, because, you meet a lot of families and a lot of people in a relatively small community. And at one point, you would know better, but the families complained about me and didn't really want me to teach their children anymore. At least there was a question about it. I think you protected me a little bit about why this particular meeting was called with all these families that I really thought I had a good relationship with, but they were fearful. And that was
give a little context. I mean, that was and it's not like, to Polly's point, maybe not so much of then and now, but in 77 was when Anita Bryant launched the Save Our Children campaign in Florida. It's very much equating homosexuality with child molestation, and very much trying to keep people away from being certainly educators. And then that got carried forward in the Briggs Amendment in California, which was literally to ban LGBT people from being teachers in the public school system. It failed, but it was a big campaign. So you were, in 1980 is when Thera was born. I think she was 2, right? When we started parenting her together. So that kind of was, I take a little issue with the question of whether Chloe was paranoid, because I know we were all.
Well, that's probably true.
It did feel like, particularly, I think, to be an educator with young children, there was that question, not to mention the custody questions. But can I get Thera in here for a minute, because I heard a story from Thera that I want her to be able to tell around, you guys had a room in the house that she was supposed to say was where Chloe slept, because you were, roommates as opposed to a family unit. And And Thera, I don't know if you told your parents this story, but I love this story so much. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah.
Well, to give a little background, I'll paraphrase a speech that my mom gave when my parents had like a wedding party, which was not their marriage ceremony because that was like grandfathered in Connecticut. Where my mom told a story about how when she and Chloe started dating, it was really scary to look to rent a house together, and there were like very specific things, like it had to be a 3-bedroom house. They could not rent a 2-bedroom house. It had to be one where like plausibly 2 adults who were not dating could live there as well as a child. And so we had this extra room with a bathroom that was Chloe's room. And so I always told everyone that Chloe was my mom's roommate. Like I'd never heard my parents use the word girlfriend or partner. None of their friends ever used that term around me. I don't, like, everyone was just someone's roommate. And I remember very distinctly the first time anyone ever asked me if my parents were gay. And we used that room. Chloe obviously didn't sleep in there. We used it as a dress-up room, and there was like an exercise bike that nobody ever used in there. And so my across the street neighbor, Mary, was over and we were playing dress up and just like fooled around. And she was like, "Hey, are your mom's lesbians?" And I like stopped for a second and thought, and I was like, "Yeah, I guess so." And that was the entire coming out about my parents for like my first recollection of somebody asking me. But it was especially funny because it took place in the room that
In
was
that room where you had been carefully told to say she sleeps.
Yeah,
so it's kind of what I love about the difference between what kids do and what they're all about, and what we're trying to control in their lives. And there's another lovely story about you and a friend that both your moms and you have told me about, who was trying to make sense of who your family was, a little boy who was trying to make sense, and he came up with something so adorable. I don't know which one of you wants to talk about that.
Yeah,
Or which one of us is going to
A
tell?
little boy who was like, what, who
Okay.
came up with a name.
You can do it. You can do it.
okay. So we were teaching together, and I think part of the issue is that people didn't know. We weren't out, so you couldn't say they are definitely lesbians and I don't like that. So they found other reasons, like the reason that, some of the parents were going after Denise is because she was doing yoga with children, and wasn't that a religion cult? So
This is 1980, 3 or 4.
it's still, it was, just trying to find reasons. And I think with the kids sort of trying to figure it out themselves, like Thera's friend. And in school, one of her very good friends, and this is when she's 3 or 4 years old, we were close with their family, and he called me Thera's Nick mom, which is kind of like Denise is the mom and I'm the Nick mom, which is kind of like a takeoff on nickname. It was his way of trying to figure it out. I understood what he was trying to do, is trying to decide on what that relationship was. And that was his term for it, which I thought was pretty cute at the time. Still do.
Yeah.
And
But I think-
much better than co-parent. I mean, we tried so many things. For a while, she was CP as for co-parent, and
You
it was
had
really hard.
you had Mother's Day, and then you had co-parent day, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, I think again, it's like these cultural messages that come inside our family lives, right? And without us necessarily even having a chance to think too much about it, right? Yeah. So, Polly, I wondered if you could get in here a little bit thinking about, because it's true that the then and now I agree with you. It's not like, wow, we're out of the woods, but there have been some significant changes around how people, at least in certain parts of the world, East Coast, United States, whatever, think about how we define our families, what language we are bringing forth into questions of policy and law and the larger culture, right? And GLAAD, I know, has so much to do with that, also in media representation and all kinds of issues. And I wonder, as you just listen, I know you know many stories like this, but here are these folks who, starting in 1980, were parenting in contexts where there was literally no external validation of what was actually happening, the nature of the relationships and the loving sort of parenting relationships that were there. I don't know if you want to speak to your view on that, given the work you do.
Yeah, I think certainly I think things have gotten better. I don't mean to suggest that I happen to work really at that kind of intersection where things often go incredibly wrong. So,
And we're living in a time where we're all worried about things
Yeah.
going much more wrong and figure
but
that
no,
out.
I mean, I think there have been in many ways, and I think, but you know, your situation, it's, you know, one of GLAAD's earliest cases in 1980 was a case where a lesbian mom, her mother was trying to take away her child through guardianship, and the Supreme Judicial Court said whether you're a lesbian has no bearing on your right to parent. And it was, you know, I feel so proud of that work and how many decades we've worked on really securing family relationships. But I do think, you know, in terms of like, let's look at marriage equality, right? I mean, despite like what's happening in kind of our national context, I feel like people people a little bit, much more so now, understand our families a little bit. They understand that, you know, there, and of course, not everyone gets married, but that we are, you know, there is a really positive outlook on marriage, right? I think Pew just came out with yet another survey. I can't remember. I think it's 69% of Americans think favorably about LGBTQ marriage. And that's a really significant number, right? That is a really positive reflection on, you know, marriage and the right to marry nationwide kind of didn't blow up the systems we know of in this country. We're just, you know, LGBTQ people want you know, have love and are just members of our community, just like everybody else. And I think that's really tremendously positive. And I think, you know, I do hear a lot about people worried about like overturning a Obergefell, for example. And I feel like it's one of those rights that is so deeply ingrained in this point, right? That it's kind of unfathomable to think that would, and of course, we're working very hard to on that, protecting the right, but, anyway, it's just it's an incredibly important cultural context we're now a part of. So anyway, so I think that's really positive. And honestly, like I think for me, like being LGBTQ, I don't, knock on wood, in and of itself, like to me, people have gotten more sophisticated, right? It's like the lack of genetic connection. It's not the fact that people are LGBTQ. So that's helpful. I do think that we have a greater understanding right now that that development and child development, like what's important, right? And that someone's identity, um, pieces of their identity, whether they have a disability, whether they're HIV positive, whether they're LGBTQ, right? Like that is totally divorced from how they're parenting their child. Now, of course, we have issues with, you know, the criminalization of poverty and the child welfare system being a little bit too eager to remove children. But I think there are a lot of really wonderful gains. And I think one of the things that Senator Sear talked about, which is really true, is that a lot of these issues aren't bipartisan. Like, honestly, like protecting children, like in every state I've worked in, really, this hasn't been a political issue. It's been an issue about protecting kids and what do kids need to thrive. Just like not only parentage work, but I do a lot of work on adoption laws and making sure people who are unmarried can adopt, making sure that there's more efficient adoption processes, particularly for people who are confirming their parentage. Like, I think there's actually a lot of really positive work to be done because people want kids to be secure. People get that children are our future and we should be making it easy for them to be secure and safe. So,
although,
anyway.
you know, it's interesting, Thera and I had an interesting conversation about this piece where you think about situations where kids might feel like they're the only one. My kids, for example, in a very, I guess, somewhat upper middle class, white, suburban town nearby. You know, they were, you know, my daughter came out as being donor conceived to her 6-year-old friends, and I got called in for the panel of everybody at the school saying, what do we do? And, you know, I could think of like one other kid I knew who, you know, had in that class who was being raised by a grandparent. Other than that, yeah, it was married. It was barely anybody divorced. It was heterosexual, all of that kind of thing. I was talking with Thera with you about it. And because for me, that really presses the issue of, do we as educators, what I said to them is like, how about talk to them about how there's all kinds of families, like let it be fine for any kid to have it, because there's lots of different ones, right? But I felt like that was on them because the kids were certainly not coming up about it in their milieu. When I said that to you, Thera, do you want to say what you told me about whether anybody in your school cared about these issues and why you didn't? I thought it was so interesting.
Well, I think, so, you know, I was in elementary school in the early mid 80s, and then I graduated from high school in 1998. And so not only was there like not even the idea of teaching about different kinds of families at that point, like that wasn't a thing that we did, but also like I went to school, I grew up in a very urban place. I'm from New Haven, Connecticut. The people that I went to school with had like a lot of other fish to fry, and like so many different kinds of families, like lots of single mothers, lots of like multi-generational households, that like someone living with like 2 adult women was like not interesting at all. And so like I never felt like I needed to explain what was going on in my household to anyone. And that might be like a child memory. I'm sure my parents had like plenty of weird interactions with people's parents who were like bigoted, but like kid on kid, like nobody cared.
And that really speaks to the question of whether you're in a diverse milieu or you're in sort of a silo, and whether life gets defined based on that kind of siloed existence. So I did want to take this chat question for you. I think probably anybody could speak to it, but I think it's a policy, is could you speak more to actions that need to be taken and are being taken now to safeguard people and families against an extreme and bigoted party potentially coming into power in the next year? Yeah, it's on a lot of people's minds, right? Even in states where there are some protections, what could be done when the feds come knocking? I mean, when you said what you did, you know, about, I'm sorry, I'm gonna say like Obergefell.
Yeah.
But didn't we think that way about Roe?
Yes, we did 100%. And Obergefell is based on different legal principles than Roe. But I will say, of course, the Supreme Court in the past, just the past 2 days where opinions have been issued, I think, on so many different grounds, we're right to be worried about the U.S. Supreme Court, right? They have really taken a veer off of the path of the past in so many different ways. But just to pause a minute I want to walk away from the Supreme Court to answer kind of the question of like the election, right? Because obviously we're going to be stuck with the Supreme Court for a while. And I do just think for everybody, like to me, there's nothing more important at this moment than educating myself about every candidate for office, down from school committee to president, and getting out and voting, right? Because even those local elections, and particularly school committees, which are really becoming a place where extremists are kind of insinuating themselves into our local communities that have such an impact on children and teachers, so important. And so run for those, learn who the folks are who are really protecting an inclusive school environment. Anyway, so vote. And then I will say, so for me, the bright side of a very terrifying federal experience at the moment or potentially in the future, is that for so much of the family law stuff, it really is state by state. It really is. Who as a parent is determined by state law. You might be able to take away my federal right to marry. You can't, there's no federal there. That parentage is a state right. And so that's one of the reasons why we're very committed to working in a bipartisan way to update state laws and make sure that every child has a path to protection, no matter how they come into our families, because those paths will be available. So I think it is a reminder that, and also we do a lot of work on educating institutions and families to say, here's how to protect your rights, here's how to secure your parentage, because of course you can have rights, but if you don't know how to get to them, it doesn't help us very much. So I would say to people out there in communities, make sure that you're spreading the word about how people can protect their families, and, doing what you can to support kind of statewide organizations that are doing that work and protecting families.
And of course, some people are living in states where that's much more difficult than others.
No, 100%. And those are difficult states. And I have thoughts for those folks too, but yes. Yeah.
That you're not sharing? I'm just curious.
Oh, sorry. I feel like I've been talking too much.
Call, there are many people not in Massachusetts on this call, by the way.
No, I know. But I do work in many other states besides Massachusetts. It happens to be that Massachusetts is, square in my really trying to get that passed.
Yeah.
But I think that's what I was saying about, like there are so many different incremental changes that you can make, right? I worked in a very conservative state to make one tweak to the adoption law so that unmarried people could adopt, right? And so that you might not be able to pass comprehensive parentage reform protecting children born through surrogacy or children born through assisted reproduction. But if you have access to adoption and you're not married, you can effectively get the same thing, right? So to me, it's about figuring out what's happening in your local environment, partnering with as many people as you can, creating a really comprehensive coalition and figuring out what are the inroads you can make to make things just a little bit better, and never give up hope, ever.
Fair enough. Okay. I mean, I think that's the other thing, I agree, like when I wrote the book, that point was made to me so clearly about its states, and part of the problem with it being states is it's also individual judges that you come up and like you can just be at the mercy of horrendous bigotry. And then the counter to that seemed to be some things that were more at a federal level to say, like, for example, the Obergefell, that's about constitutional rights and reading those, including LGBTQ. But I hear you saying, yeah, and it also only goes so far in the actual way our country works. Is that a fair way of putting it? Yes.
I mean, one can appeal a state Supreme Court case if necessary. I mean, there's certain places, but in which you can appeal it up to the U.S. Supreme Court, but in general, family law is going to be really a creature of states. And I would say, you mentioned about courts and bias in courts, and of course that exists for so many groups of people, so many people, right? I remember going into a courtroom just seeking a gender marker change for a trans client, and the judge said to me, I don't care. I was seeking to impound the file, and the judge said to me, I don't care about your client and the discrimination and violence they're going to face. I'm not going to make that, I'm going to let it be a public file, right? Like, this bias in courts is kind of to me, is part of the constant work of democracy, right? Like, we always have to be doing that education for ourselves and for others against explicit and implicit bias, to try to make sure everybody's going in front of these institutions with, hopefully, as much fairness as possible.
So I'm going to shift gears just a little to, well, actually, maybe not so much shifting gears, but again, it gets to that intimacy level, because you two you had a civil union, then you got married. And I think there might have been some discussion about adoption more recently. I think I just heard. Want to tell us that? Because I think that's about, again, some of just the psychological implications of these larger cultural issues. So yeah. So tell us about the union, the marriage, and the adoption question. Yeah.
Right. So we had a civil union because there wasn't marriage at the time in Connecticut or federally. And then when the federal legislation went through, we didn't realize that what Connecticut does is that they just kind of take these civil unions and make them marriages without telling us. So we thought that we had to go back and get married again. Get married. So we went down to City Hall and they said, well, no, you're already married. So unless you want to get divorced, then you can get married again. And we were a little crestfallen because we had this big party planned, and two things came out of that, which is, one, the people who obviously came were family and friends who were very supportive of us. But as you were saying, Polly, that people forget, like what it was like, and not realizing that it's still like that in a lot of other places besides sort of liberal towns on the East Coast. And Denise told the story about, really having to be protective of Thera, and sort of really worried that, what she was doing was going to mean Thera was going to give her up. And we had people crying in in our party, really taken, because people forget that's happens. They think, okay, we have this and now it's all done, we can
everything's fine.
Right.
Two things came out of it. Was that one of them? And
say that again?
you said two things. I thought I was just reminding you. You said two things came out of that.
People forget, and
that people forget. I think I'm not quite sure what the other second one
Well,
was.
because I think it might be the adoption conversation, because I know
The
Thera
adoption,
was
right.
married, so
So that actually came out of Thera talking with you, Laura, about that. Thera, even although she's 44 years old, we didn't know that we could adopt her. I could adopt her after she turned 18, which I would have loved to have done, and didn't really know that that was an option. So we are going to do it now.
But it was confusing because of course we wanted to do it before that, but then we would have had to contact her father and get somehow his parental rights terminated, and none of that was even vaguely a good idea. So we talked about it even when she was little, but there was nothing that we could do about it.
And I think also that if we'd done that when I was little, I would have forced you guys to come out and then would have endangered your jobs.
Absolutely,
And
yeah,
then I didn't know that there was adult adoption.
right.
Tara,
Right,
though, you
Lexi?
said, I mean, part of the conversation you and I had, that this came out of, which I didn't know until just recently, was that you said when they got married, it was like nice they got married, but you had some feelings about what it did or didn't mean for your relationship to Chloe, that it didn't
Oh.
necessarily, and I think that's what if you could
Yeah,
just
I
share more
mean-
why that mattered to you, yeah.
I don't think it necessarily changed anything because our family was never about like legal rights.
Yeah. Mhm.
So I was really happy that they were able to be related for, emergency medical reasons and taxes, and because they did the thing that they wanted to do, but it didn't actually directly impact my relationship with my parents.
Right.
But why
And-
did the adoption then seem like something important to you?
I think that's more important to me as sort of like just a statement about who my family is.
Mhm.
Mhm. Mhm.
But Polly, maybe you want to speak to this. Is it also true that it actually does matter? I'm trying to understand the connection between Chloe's relationship to Thera and whether it's legally or not acknowledged as an adoption would do. Are there any significant features of that?
Well, there are,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, and I'm glad. I think that's so great. I actually think adult adoption is such a great option for folks who particularly have complexity and can't kind of clarify their parentage for one way or the other, to know that, hey, when the child turns 18 or afterwards, there is that flexibility, right? And you
Yeah.
can do it if it makes sense for your family. So one of the things an adult adoption might make sense for is because that parent-child relationship can matter for like intestacy rights or decision-making rights, right?
Mhm.
She will then be, a legal child of Chloe and be able to inherit from her without a will, be able to have hospital visitation privileges, like all of those things that she, of course, or, now, is making her own medical decisions for herself and whatnot. But now as her parents age, she might want to have that kind of security on the other way, right? So there might very well be a reason to do that.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I want to turn a little bit of attention to you, Tara, and your work at Collage. Can you tell us about that? I mean, not just your current work, but your whole history with Collage, and explain to people what it is.
Well, I haven't been involved with Collage for that long because I didn't find out about it until a couple of years ago. But Collage is a group for queer spawn meaning children of LGBTQIA plus, etc. Families, and it began sometime in the 80s, and I believe had sort of like multiple branches, and now has sort of these groups where there's like Family Week that's happening in P-Town next week. There's fundraising, there's sort of like a policy branch that is working on parental rights. And then there are these groups for adults of gay parents. And I didn't know the term queer spawn. I think that wasn't coined until sort of the mid to late 90s. But I had a joke with my friends. Most of my friends are queer. And I always said that I was ethnically gay because I was raised in the lesbian tradition. And so I've like talked to these groups, and I'm pre-Gaby boom, right? So Gaby boom is when all of the artificial insemination and adoptions were happening. That was sort of starting like 85 or something. So I'm a little bit older, and what I noticed in talking to people who are like my age, or slightly older in the group, is that most of them have gay fathers. And so that means that there's like a whole bunch of people who had gay mothers and like don't know. And I think that's really interesting, because like you think about in terms of family rights, like it was like if you were a woman raising a child, you had a lot to lose if you came out as being a lesbian. And so like there's all of these people who I know who will talk about like their dad's experience as gay men going through the AIDS epidemic, and it's like heart-wrenching and awful. And then I'm like, where are the people who have like mothers who have my experience? And I can provide the link to collage in just a minute. It's a
No,
great.
you can, we send out a survey, I'll just tell you, and when we send it out, we will ask you to include the link. So
Okay.
people will get it and they won't even have to worry about it right now. So
Great.
Yeah.
And so one of the cool things that I'm doing as like a person on the advisory board is we're working on, we've digitized years and years of the newspaper, which is like a for us, by us, like queer spawn newsletter from like the mid 80s until, you know, the early 2000s. And so there's just really great, lovely stories by like children of gay parents talking about things. There was one that really stuck out to me as being like, why I love it when my mom's friend Adrian Rich visits. And I was like, oh my God. And so they're really wonderful. They're all on the website. And it's just like, when you think about, when like the general public thinks about like queer people, they don't think about the families and like the children. And so this is such a great historic record of like the experiences of these kids, and like what it was like to be a child being raised by gay people in like the 80s and 90s and onwards.
It's really fantastic. And Thera, I wonder if you could help us understand a little bit, what are your reflections about having grown up in that way? Because we're hearing in your story, there was like you would do a code switch, it almost sounds like, right? There were ways you had to be closeted, there were ways you forgot to be closeted, there was all kinds of things. And now we are in this somewhat different era, debatable as Polly has said. But what is your reflection on all of that and what that's all meant to you from where you are now as an adult and an artist?
I think I was born sort of at a good time, so that by the time I was in high school, I had friends who were out and who were queer, and I was sort of involved in an artistic community where that was much more accepted. Granted, my like queer friends in high school faced a large amount of bullying, but it wasn't like, I hear some stories of people who were like so ashamed of their families, and I definitely never felt any of that. And again, I don't know how much of that is like growing up in a really diverse area where like there were just so many things going on that people weren't like particularly worried about somebody's family format, or if I was just really lucky. But yeah, I think.
Do you know, what did you make of knowing you had something you had to hide, knowing you had parents who could be hurt by like what you said a few minutes ago, if we went for adoption, that there were ways that you seem aware that it might have hurt them and their professions. Like, I'm just curious what you feel at different stages of life or now when you look back on it, you think you made. And also even saying that your family's not about legal connection and never was about legal.
I mean, now I feel sad that we had to live like that. That's deeply unfair for any child or anybody to have to hide who they are for fear of like having their loved ones taken away from each other. But that at the time, I think I was just like, well, this is just how it is. Like, they are roommates, and that's just the term. And there wasn't really a discussion. Like I don't know when Heather Has Two Mommies came out or whatever. But there weren't mainstream books about children with queer families, although my mom did a wonderful job getting me all of the books from Lollipop Press, from Feminist Press children's books. I have a book called Lots of Mommies about a little girl who grew up in a as far as I can tell, a lesbian commune. And so like there are some really, like I personally felt like I was encountering like representation left and right, but like in the broader span, like it definitely is like a sad situation, and it's like definitely vastly improved now, despite the fact that it's like a constant battle for people to be treated like humans.
Yeah, I do hear that. I think I also feel like, I guess I was partly wondering if you had thought about, like, I think that your worldview gets affected, you know, it actually, it's not that it's good that that happens to people, because it's not, but when you are faced with things like that, you start to make distinctions between what values people might bring and try to impose on you and what your actual values are. So when, for example, your family's not about legal connection, but you know who loves you and who takes care of you and who you love, and you start to sort of parse that at a younger age. I think that's what I was sort of hearing a little bit from you, and even being protective of people because of larger cultural discrimination, I think is something that when people don't have these experiences, I think actually are at risk of having very narrow view of the world and lacking empathy for others, since so many people have that. So I was just wondering if that had influenced you at all. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if you had thought about
My parents could probably better answer how early on I became the way I am.
it. You're on mute.
I'm sorry, you heard it probably better than I did, the question.
Well,
Well, I
how
know one
Tara
story.
became the person. Go ahead.
I mean, I know that, Thera, I know you, I guess you were 15 when you came home with a button that said, I love my two mommies, right? So there were ways, I feel like, because you were growing up in a different generation, as you just said, with a different level, that you were positioned a little differently than they were necessarily. And also because they also knew some of the risks for themselves and for you when you were young that they protected you from. So I guess I was just imagining from the way that Thera has talked that there was a certain kind of maturity that happened pretty early for her around parsing these different ways that people would look at your family versus how your family actually felt to those of you who were in it. That's really what I was asking.
I think Tara was a was a very sensitive kid right from the start, and also and very passionate about human rights, and still is. And I think that that's a thread that's gone through her life. You know, I mean, one of the things I remember is Tara being at an airport, and there was this young girl about Tara's age who was in the corner crying, and
There
you
was
know,
no
all of us,
adults.
there were no adults around it, but the adults that were there, that were strangers, really kind of ignored it. And Tara went over and talked to her, you know, and of course, you know, when your child does something kind like that, you know, it just melts your heart. But that's who she is. So, and is that because we're lesbians? I don't know. Be hard to
Well, I
do a control group on that
Yeah.
to figure that one out.
But I do think it's because we have always worked for families and young children.
Mhm.
I do think that that has always been important to both of us in our various jobs. And that it's been clear that many families have many difficulties that we feel like could be addressed, and we want to be part of addressing those problems. And so I think that that is a large part of why you've been sensitive to it. And of course, it does blend in with the fact that we raised you that way, and that
Yeah.
you were so important to us that we had a child of our own.
What do you think, Thera? Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I also will just go back to the I love my two mommies button for a minute, since I know we're running short on time. But I think this is a good story because this was 1996, 1997. I was in P-Town with my moms. We went to Women Craft, a store, and I found a pin that said, I heart my two mommies. And I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. I've never seen anything like this. And I got it. I wore it to the art summer camp I went to at Wesleyan. And there was a girl in my dorm who at the end of the summer, I learned that she had seen my pin, and instead of being like, oh, she has two mothers, because in her mind that was impossible. And so her narrative was that I was a teen lesbian mom and my child had gotten the pin and then given it to me. And somehow that made more sense. And so like that's a kind of like world that it was even in the 90s where it was like unthinkable that like you might have two moms, which is so bizarre.
Yeah, but I do really hear how there's like that parsing of all the different perspectives and different ways people treat each other, and coming from some core values in your family of love and empathy, and recognition of difficulties people have all over. Polly, I wonder if you could take us out. We have to stop in a minute, but I did want to ask you that kind of personal reflection question. You've chosen a certain kind of work life, and I don't know where that comes from in you, or what that, sort of the mission-driven piece that you have, because you've been so helpful to us around thinking about what we all ought to be doing and worrying about and getting on. How does this work in your life? What do you want to close us out with?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I've loved hearing about this family and having this conversation. So I guess, I came out at a relatively early age, right? I came out in the mid 1990s and when I was in high school. And I would say I kind of knew early on that I wanted to work in the LGBTQ rights movement in some way or another. And of course that shifted, there was no kind of direct path, but it was definitely something I was passionate about. My own family was not super supportive of me growing up, and I really wanted to create a world where more people experienced inclusion and equality. So yeah, and then when I did a lot of work during law school, I found that the piece that was most interesting to me in the LGBTQ work was family law. Honestly, because I'm a people person. It's as basic as that. I love people. I love their stories. I love kind of helping people through their most challenging time as a family. And so I actually did divorce and guardianship for quite a bit of time and came to work with GLAAD in those cases, right? Because I was really working with actually a single mother by choice who had her child through known donor insemination very early on around this time in the 80s. And she was really had such a phenomenal kind of public interest stint to our law firm. And it was really about how can we help the community? How can we make a body of law that is about equality for children and families? Anyway, and now I have children of my own, and it's been fun to hear about, I think if they were here talking, they would have very much their own perspective. It's really, their own experience as kids of LGBTQ families. So definitely so passionate about this area of the law, and which I think honestly is just about, our families and our communities. And I love that.
And again, just the human. I think I hear that in all of your stories and your commitments to human beings.
Yeah.
It's tough and it's tough enough. How do we help each other out and make it not tougher for really anybody, And I so appreciate that from Senator Sear, from you, Polly, and from the three of you. It's just been such like an honor for me and a privilege for me to sit with you and hear how you're all doing that in the world and what you've all made of this complexity of some of the challenges we're all living with. So I want to just thank you so much for taking the time to come on and talk with us about all of this.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, because in many ways, this also facilitated all the three of us to go back in time and think about our family, and kind of share ideas and memories that I don't think we just hadn't thought about doing. We just have accepted that was the past. So thank you.
I really love that, because there's things that get spoken and things that don't get spoken in families, not for any particular reason necessarily. They don't have to get spoken about. And I'm sure, Thera, that you think about that as an artist. Like that, to me, that's one of the beauties of literature, right? Is to be able to put yourself in a number of people's shoes and see how they all come together. So it's been such a privilege and an honor. And you guys are wonderful. Thank you for just being you, and carry on. And to the audience, you've been fabulous for this whole series. I want to thank you all so much. We will be sending a survey, and we really do care about your results. So we'd love it if you send that back to us. And we will include in that survey any information that Polly and Thera and Denise and Chloe, and also I will check in with Senator Sear if there's any particular information that people want to share and to go out to. It'll go out with our survey. So I hope you all have a wonderful summer and take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.